Hello, everyone. Everybody knows this lecture is in English, right, today, right? That was clearly communicated, I hope? Okay. My name is Olave Bassabosa, and it is both an honor and a pleasure to be welcoming you all to the opening lecture of the 2022-23 Studium Generale Gent lecture series. I am the coordinator of the Studium Generale Gent, and over the last year, my team, our external partners, and myself have worked really hard towards this very moment. It is customary to name and thank everyone that you worked with at the very end of the evening, but I will ask you to permit me to deviate from this custom. I want to express my deep gratitude for the amazing people I've worked with in the last year, before the whole drama of the evening has happened. I want to start with them. First of all, I want to thank Camille Castagne and Simon van de Zande. These are two people who were basically 95% of the Studium Generale team for the last year. This summer, they went on for bigger and better pursuits in their lives. But they did so after having dedicated a year of their skills, their competences, and passion to what is a program that I'm very proud of this year. I also wanted to thank Helena Verheij and Silke Gerings, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name right, who are the two newest additions to the Studium Generale team. And I want to thank you already for your hard work, your creativity, and patience with me, most of all, in these last few weeks. I also want to thank my various colleagues at the Casque and Conservatorium who helped me curate this year's theme and program it. And I'm thinking of Godard Bakker from Casque Lezingen, Philippe Raté, the dean of Casque and Conservatorium, the new dean, Sophie van Damme, Lars Quackenbos. There were many people who helped out. But I would be remiss to not mention an external co-curator of some sort, Chihiro Geuzenbroek, who I am very grateful to have been able to really pick their brilliant mind as we were conceiving of this program. I'm particularly happy to announce one new partner that we have this year. It's Arenberg Schouwburg from Antwerp, and with them, we're starting a podcast starting from January 2023, and the podcast is called The Future is Ecological, and I'm very excited that we're starting this new partnership this year. Most notably, Kate Doms has been my partner in crime at Arenberg, and I'm very happy about that. Obviously, we have some of our older partners, just more established partners. Isaac de May from Academia Press, who remains a great source of inspiration. And the many, many people at Vooruit. No, it's not Vooruit anymore. What is it now? 404. I'm not from Ghent, that's obvious. I haven't kept up with everything. And I'm really grateful for basically having that community. It really takes a village to conceive, curate, and execute a Studium Gent program, believe me. And in that village, there are the very, very special people of the Casque and Conservatorium communication team. Jonas Temmerman, Claire Stragier, Ilse de Hond, and Arthur Hegeman, without whom no one would know we exist. And they are amazing in that regard, and I'm actually just every year, I've been doing this for 3 years, and I remain extremely grateful and surprised at the kind of warmth and support we can count on from so many different people. Like, I'm just very grateful. So on behalf of the entire Studium team, the old one and the new team, I want to thank all these amazing people. Okay, it's time to get started with tonight's program. But before doing so, this is going to take a long time, by the way. This takes about 15 minutes of your time. Excuse me, we're going to get to you. I'm gonna start off with a quick introduction of the Studium Generale Gent. Some of you may not know what the Studium Generale Gent is. And I will also introduce this year's Future Ecologies theme. And I also want to do a quick proposal for the tone and mood that we want to have for our gathering, our encounter tonight. So, the Studium Generale Gent is a Hoog-Gent course and a public program that invites its audience to discussions, debates, and critical reflections on society, art, culture, and science. We do this by curating and hosting 10 lectures each year that is centered, and we center that around an annual theme. Now, through consultations, like I said, with my inspired colleagues at Kasken Conservatorium, our various external partners, and our good friend Chihiro Geuzebroek of the Studium Gent, I present to you our theme this year, which is Future Ecologies. I'm going to quote Malcolm Ferdinand, who wrote Une écologie décoloniale last year, and he says, the dualistic opposition that separates nature and culture, environment and society, establishing a vertical scale of values that places man above nature, it is revealed through the technical, scientific, and economic modernizations of mastering nature, whose effects are measured in the extent of the pollution of the earth, the loss of biodiversity, the disruption of the climate, and in the measure of gender inequalities, social misery, and disposable lives that are engendered. He's talking here about something called the Great Divide, the separation from man and nature. Now, we at Studium Generale Gent were extremely inspired by calls like his for the rejection of this separation from man and nature. So we decided to explore this year a future-oriented ways of thinking, propositions, and imaginings which presuppose the inextricable intertwining of humans with their environment and their non-human neighbors, such as animals, but also non-animals. We want to think of humans as part and not master and lord of ecological systems. And ecological systems are defined as dynamic life communities of living organisms and their physical environment. So to that end, Studium Gent invited thinkers, doers, makers, and researchers to share with you, our audience, their learned and creative visions of the future of the ecological systems that house, enable, threaten, and or challenge our societies. And our first guest speaker is Dr. Mihnea Tănăsescu. He holds a BA in Human Ecology from the College of the Atlantic in Maine, and an MA in Continental Philosophy from the New School for Social Research in New York, and which is a really interesting school, like amazing panel conversations I follow on their YouTube page religiously, but that's just me. I'm very nerdy on the new school. He obtained his PhD, very close to here, in political science from the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, with a dissertation focusing on the relationship between representation and rights for nature in the 2008 Ecuadorian Constitution. You're currently a research fellow at the University of Mons. His main interests are the politics of nature, environmental ethics, the political representation of non-humans, restoration ethics, which I think we're going to hear a lot about tonight, rewilding, and environmental policy. And his most recent books are Understanding the Rights of Nature and Ecocene Politics, which I think we're going to talk a lot about today. Yeah, it's also the title of your... But before again, this takes a long time. I want to say a few words about the tone we strive for at all of our Studium lectures. We are cognizant that the topics we will be addressing this year can and will elicit intensive thoughts and feelings. We believe that a collective commitment to the intention of care can help us shape the tone, the nature, and perhaps the beauty of our gathering tonight. we understand the intention of care to be multidimensional. So first, there is the intention to be caring towards our speakers. Then there is the intention to be caring towards each other. And last but not least, the intention to be caring towards ourselves. Now, how can we be caring towards a speaker? I want to be quite concrete and literal about this. We think it is important to always keep in mind that they are guests that have been invited to speak and share their ideas, their research, and their ambitions for a better future. We ask you to help us extend the warmest hospitality to our guests, the kind of hospitality that allows them to be vulnerable with us, vulnerable in their feelings and in their thinking, vulnerable enough to make mistakes, to have the courage to not have all the answers, or even to use the best terms or words, to have made choices in what they want to talk about and what they don't want to talk about. That's the intention to take care of our guests. The second intention that we think is important is the intention to take care of each other. We think of it as being full of care in how you address each other and also how you hear each other. Later on during the Q&A or perhaps in moments of eruptions, you might say something about or to each other. And we want you to always keep in mind that that when you do so, that the studium lectures are pedagogical in nature. And it is a sound practice in pedagogical spaces to respect each other's dignity, to believe in each other's earnestness, and to nurture each other's curiosity, and above all, to feed each other's desire to learn. Now, last, again, not least, we encourage you all to practice care for yourselves. Pedagogical spaces require us to practice self-care in the form of introspection, especially when we find ourselves feeling uncomfortable or even distraught. I want to encourage you all to not only sit with that discomfort, but to study it with open curiosity. What worldview or view of yourself is endangered in this particular moment? How did you come to acquire this or that belief? And what or who is really placed at risk by this or that perspective? So, in summary, we ask you to be full of care for our guests, for one another, and for yourselves. And that's almost it. Tonight, Dr. Tănăsescu introduces us to the, I would call, emerging concept of Ecocene. Is it emerging? Oh, you tell us. It's always emerging? The Ecocene, a new temporal epoch characterized by increasingly frequent intrusions and disruptions of ecological processes into political life. Or better said, Dr. Tănăsescu will offer us tonight his learned and inspired proposition for a political philosophy that is attuned to the challenges and opportunities of existing in the Ecocene. Please help me welcome Dr. Mihnea Tănăsescu with a warm Studium Gent applause. It's all yours. It's all yours. Wait,
thank you.
I have to take this with me.
Take your microphone. There you go. Voila.
Okay, good luck.
Thank
you
you.
Can do this.
Hi, everyone. I can't actually see you because of the light, but I trust you're there. I don't know how to follow that, Olaf, particularly the care part. That touched me. We can talk about it later. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's such a pleasure. Thank you, Olaf, for your invitation, and everyone for organizing. So, as you expertly explained, this is the beginning of a series on future ecologies. And yet, tonight, I choose to begin this series by talking about the tragedy that has already happened. So, what is the sense of this movement from past to future and back? What are the future ecologies that we have to begin thinking about by thinking about what has already happened? How do we go from one to the other? And why actually start with a tragedy at all? What is the tragedy? And how do we think this being torn between a future of uncertain ecologies and a past that I'm going to describe as nurturing a tragedy that has happened? And what exactly risks this tearing us apart between the past and the future? Of course, these are big questions that there's no single answer to. And that would be ridiculous to claim that I will give the answer. Of course not. But I'll try to tell a story and to paint a picture. I'll try to draw a landscape of thought, just one amongst many, and one that needs to cohabit with others. And I will spend some time talking about cohabitation. I think it's really important to think about ways through the tragedy that has already happened in terms of multiple cohabitations and not just one story. So what is the tragedy? Well, first of all, what is a tragedy? Well, a tragedy, I think, can be characterized as a genre of suffering that nonetheless awakens you to something else. The tragedy is a way to work through suffering towards awakening. In a tragic story, the heroine or the hero undergoes challenges, and if it ends badly for them, then everybody else draws the lesson, awakens to a new reality, or if they get through the challenge and come out of the other side, then they are awakened to something new. They see things in a different kind of way. So tragedy has both these moments of, on the one hand, suffering, an increasing of suffering, as it were, and an awakening. And what I call the tragedy that has already happened is a generalized sense of loss, which comes with a sense of mourning that I think a lot of us are already familiar with. The sense of loss is the underside, the underbelly, if you will, of what we call ecological crisis. Through ecological crisis, we experience loss. Now, when we think about ecological crisis nowadays, we mostly think about climate change. And that, unfortunately, if that was the only ecological crisis, it would actually be good news. It gives you an idea. According to the Stockholm Resilience Center, there's 9 different, what they call planetary boundaries, that we are overstepping, amongst them fresh water use, the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, land use changes, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. All of this, I think, are a sign of loss, tragedy as loss. And what are we losing? Well, for one, we're losing environmental conditions that we thought we knew. CO2 is a change in environmental conditions of the atmosphere that has particular consequences. Biodiversity loss, the same. This also translates into what I would call a loss of footing, a disorientation, when old and familiar categories are crumbling. Old and familiar categories, not only ecologically, but also socially speaking. New emotions, ecological anxiety, ecological depression, solastalgia. There's new names for new emotions that we're feeling in the face of ecological loss. The loss of old categories of social organization like class. Bruno Latour, who sadly passed away a couple of weeks ago, talked in his last work about a new emergent ecological class. This is a decomposition of what we thought we knew society was made of, and the recomposition. It's also a loss of worlds and of places, the familiar becoming unrecognizable. We no longer recognize the seasons, the fruiting cycles, the crops or the landscapes that were familiar. That is another kind of loss. And finally, what I would call a loss of predictability. Before the current era, and we'll talk about what era that is, we were in the Holocene, the period of time where all of human civilization as we know it in all of its shapes and forms developed. And the Holocene, after the last ice age, was a period that was particularly friendly to human activity, of a particularly mild climate, that was predictable enough. Predictable enough to allow for human activity that was, again, good enough. We didn't have to get it exactly right for us to be able to live or even thrive in the Holocene. In other words, the Holocene was an era with a pretty wide margin of error. In the new era, that margin of error is shrinking, and in that sense, we are undergoing a loss of predictability of what future ecologies may look like. Now, we really need a lot of imagination to work through all of these kinds of loss that I termed a tragedy. And thankfully, there's lots of that around. So what I want to do today is present some ideas. None of them are new per se. I just want to paint them in my own way, braid them as it were, to give an idea of how different imaginations can help us work through, digest, metabolize the loss. Well, where are we living? I think the first step is to name where we are and what we are living through. Of course, naming is very important in thinking about anything at all, because naming gives you an idea of where you are. Naming is a way of describing, and description always comes with prescription. Those two are inseparable. Saying where you are also tells you where you could be and opens up the possibilities of what you've described. It tells you what's possible. A good example of this to anchor it are maps. So maps are supposed to be an accurate description of a territory, but depending on the kind of map and its the intention of the makers, it also tells you what you can do with a territory. It gives you possibilities. But no map gives you the whole territory. No map gives you all possibilities. So, for instance, in the history of colonization, maps not showing people, not showing habitation, were used to colonize. The terra nullius, right? The empty lands. Mapping lands as empty gives you the possibility of colonizing them. So describing, naming empty land, naming whatever we want to name our era as, gives you a whole set of prescriptions that you can work with, but none of these descriptions give you all possibilities. And that's why naming is important. The usual name that has been adopted for our new era is that of the Anthropocene. And I think everybody here, if interested in this theme, probably has heard the term, the age of humans, of anthropos. Now I think this is a very good geological description. It's a very good geological description because it explains how future geologists, thousands of years from now, working through stratigraphy, through the layers of the earth, through the accumulation of sediments, will be able to discern a layer that bears the mark, or undeniable mark, of human activity. Now, geologists work with very, very slow time, so they haven't officially adopted the name Anthropocene. According to official geology, we're still in the Holocene. We need time for geologists to come around and say, no, actually, we're living in the Anthropocene. But it's a very good description from that point of view. The causes of the Anthropocene are given as many, but the one I prefer is the Great Acceleration. So after the Second World War, the increase in consumption of basically everything you can imagine, which leads to what I would call a great reshuffling. Interchangeableness of environments and species and ways of living that flattens what was to be richer worlds. Now, this geological description is not always taken as geological. We think of the Anthropocene in moral ways, in political ways, in social ways. And that's where its prescriptive power, I think, is quite narrow. The Anthropocene description is based on humans, on the one hand, and nature on the other. And these are very widespread critiques of the politics of the Anthropocene. In other words, Geology, obviously thinking at the grandest scales, cannot think about situations, cannot think about this particular humans having done this particular thing. It has to think of the species, just like it thinks of tectonic movements. It makes sense for geology to think of the planet. It makes sense for it to think of the human species doing X to the planet. But if we think about that in political terms, then a lot of people get off the hook, because it is not the human species as such that has ushered in the Anthropocene. Thinking in that way, again, politically, leads to prescriptions of top-down kinds of managerial solutions or technical fixes, geoengineering being a good example of it. There's people called eco-modernists that even call for further acceleration. The problem with the Anthropocene is that we have not accelerated enough. Okay? The dream of modernity, of course, is the total separation of humans from nature. We no longer depend on natural processes. Well, if we achieve that and we can geoengineer the rest, we're good to go. But that's the kind of prescription that the Anthropocene, taken as more than a geological description, makes possible. Thankfully, there's lots of other alternatives. For instance, the Capitalocene points to capitalism as the engine of the Anthropocene, and that gives a certain number of possibilities as to how to address it, mostly evidently in anti-capitalist ways. The Plantationocene identifies the plantation as a system of exploitation of both people and environments as an engine of the Anthropocene. Equally, the Black Anthropocene identifies the bodies, black and brown bodies, as the initial engine of the Anthropocene and of the Great Acceleration, a kind of fossil fuel avant la lettre, where the metabolism of brown and black bodies was used to power global capital. All of these are great names in their own ways. They all give different prescriptive stances. But I want to come back to where we started. We started from loss. So let's give what we feel like we're losing central stage. And what I said we're losing are ecological conditions, predictability, and the familiarity of the environing world. So if that's the case, let's think about ecology, because it's ecological processes that are leading social transformations. It's because of the way in which ecological processes themselves have changed, no matter what the causes are, that we're here talking about this today, that we have an ecological politics to speak of. We are ignorantly poking, us humans, but we're not in the driving seat. We're omnipotent without being omniscient. We know how to do lots of things, but we don't know where it's going. So if ecology is to be taken as central in a politics of the present moment of loss, then I would suggest we talk about the Ecocene, the age of ecology. Ecology, the word, comes from oikos in Greek, which means home, abode. Now, a home of a creature, of a living, cannot perish. As long as there is a creature, there is its home. The only thing it can do is change. In other words, for the study of creaturely homes, ecology, interrelations are key. Ecology studies the interrelations that make up a home that is hospitable to a particular kind of creature. But interrelations are always somewhere. There is no generalized home. To say the planet is my home is, in my view, to say nothing at all. Because unless you can also live in Mars, to say that the planet is my home gives no useful information at all. A home is always somewhere. What William Drury, one of my favorite ecologists, called a comfortable disequilibrium. When we talk about ecology in political thought or social thinking, we often use it in a very vague way. What I'm interested in is to be precise as to what we can inherit from it that can help us along in our political and social thinking. And I think there's three things that we can inherit from it to learn to live through the age of ecology. So I said that homes are always dynamic interrelations, is where different processes meet to create a space that is livable. But homes always change. So the first idea I want to underline is the idea of change. Ecology is the science of change. Disturbance and disequilibrium are the norm. In fact, without those, survival is at stake. There is no harmony or balance in ecology. The idea of harmony and the idea of balance, when we think about nature in those terms, is a moral idea. It is not an ecological idea. Ecology studies disturbance and, at best, comfortable disequilibriums. Nowadays, no society can count on the future of their environment. But in fact, we never could, because homes are in constant change. So, I think what ecological change suggests is that we can recuperate both human and non-human ways of living with change, seeing how the world has always changed. Societies that have come before us have experimented of necessity with dealing with change. We could do worse than look at them again. The second idea is that of chance. As far as any creature is concerned, things happen to it. In a way, there is a pathos of the living. The world is undergone by creatures. Interruptions, arbitrary terror, uncertainty, and fundamentally unpredictable futures are the marks of the living. If Earth is a mother, then she's a pretty strict and often violent one that often terrorizes her children in eruptions of violence. That is the chance that ecology often describes, what Isabel Stengers calls the eruption of Gaia, thing that is never foreseen, never welcome, but it nonetheless happens. The earthquake, the volcano, the hurricane, the heat wave. For any creature that undergoes that, it is an event that it undergoes that's greater than it is an event of chance. And finally, we said that oikos, the home, is always a somewhere. In other words, there is the idea of locality. Where do we find ourselves? In ecology, that is a fundamental question. The dynamic events that form lives always happen in a particular locality. In other words, situations matter greatly in ecology. They don't matter as much in geology. There isn't the situation of a tectonic plate, the home of the tectonic plate and where it finds itself. But when you talk about the study of the home of the living, situations are everything. Where are we? To who does that matter? To who do things in that particular situation matter? What creaturely groupings matter and where and for what reasons? Those are the kinds of questions that you can ask when you think of ecology as locality as well. Now, this isn't a denial of aggregate thinking, of the global, for instance. Instead, it is a way of doing what Bruno Latour called a bringing down to earth. In other words, is bringing down processes that are also expressed at the global level to where things matter for creatures. And Max Liboiron talks about the issue of scale, not as a matter of quantity, the scale, the global scale being bigger and the local scale being smaller, but rather a matter of where things matter. The global matters when you are undergoing climate change negotiations, for example. Negotiations between states are going to be in terms of the global, in terms of states, in terms of nations, in terms of societies. Now, that is the scale where the global matters. The situational scale is where things matter for individual creatures of groups of creatures. It's not a smaller scale, it's just a different map of what matters to who, for what reason, in what situation. So chance, change, and locality describe, I think, creaturely life in an ecological sense, but they also describe environments. They also describe what we usually call the abiotic as opposed to the biotic, so the matter as opposed to life. Now, the difference there between biotic and abiotic is a difference of intensity and a difference of rhythm. The issue of chance, change, and locality doesn't change as such. So what we're interested in is not only the interrelations between creatures, but also between creatures and their environing world. If we're going to study the home of the living, you have to study the relationship with the environment as well. But these are not the relationship between life and matter. The environment is not dead matter. Why? Well, because life modifies its own material conditions, just like we do, sometimes with terrible results. This idea was most famously proposed by James Lovelock in the Gaia hypothesis, which I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about. And it has been appropriated as a sort of spiritualist, moralist way of understanding the unity of the earth. But in fact, what Lovelock was doing was much more interesting than that. He was a scientist at NASA, and he was hired to look for life on other planets. And he had a project looking for life on Mars. And by looking at Mars, he turned his gaze back on the planet Earth and realized that the planet Earth is a really funky kind of planet. It's a very special place amongst planets. In other words, planet Earth became situated amongst other planets and all of a sudden appeared in its wonderful ecology. Planet Earth is the only planet we know of that is what it is because of the living that inhabit it. So he said, well, it's useless to send probes to Mars. We just have to look at the fact that its atmosphere is stable to know that it has no life. Because that means that there's nothing that metabolizes Mars and no metabolic products that come out of that are discernible. Earth does not have a stable atmosphere, and that is because of the living. If it was a planet like every other, it would not change. So the Gaia hypothesis starts from that insight. From the insight that the relationship between life and matter is one that is co-constitutive. That the way in which life leads itself changes its own material conditions. Now, Lynn Margulis, a brilliant biologist, brought this global scale of Gaia down to the creaturely level. And she looked at how particular living beings and matter are in constant change and exchange. For instance, she showed that there was over 50 unique minerals only produced in living bodies. Things that you would think of as off-dead matter minerals. Well, there's over 50 of them that we know of so far that are only produced within living bodies. But most importantly, and where Margulis made her most important mark, is in the way she demonstrated that beings are never singular. There is no such thing as a being in the singular. Now, the condition of being plural itself modifies its environment, which modifies the creature, and so on and so forth. You get the picture. So instead of talking about individuals, Lynn Margulis proposed the term holobiont, which basically means an aggregate, a symbiotic way of life. And she has a book called The Symbiotic Life as well. And another one that I recommend with her son, Darian Sagan, which is called simply What is Life? Right? What a brilliant title for a book. What is life? So, not being singular means that we are any particular creature, us including, modify our own environment, and are made of a plurality of beings. And we know, for instance, that most of our DNA is not human DNA, it's microbial. Most of your biomass is not human biomass, it's microbial, bacterial, viruses. She showed, for instance, that evolution is not a linear process that respects species, but that lots of microbial life exchange genes horizontally. The relationship between the living themselves and their environment is much more complicated than we thought. So in this back and forth dynamic life world, creatures deal with precarity, with unknown alliances, and with the consequences of changing their own conditions. And that should sound familiar, the consequences of changing our own environmental conditions. Now, how does this focus on ecology, and very specifically bringing out what I think we can inherit from ecology, how does this help us think future ecologies in our oikos, our home? Well, one thing I want to suggest going forward is to interpret this creaturely openness in terms of a familiar term, that of vulnerability. I want to interpret creaturely openness as a way of being vulnerable. Now, vulnerability here is a double sense. The one we're more familiar with is that of a certain kind of powerlessness, the ability of being hurt. There's a negative vulnerability. I want to instead propose a positive vulnerability, as a power, as it were. Vulnerability is the condition of being ecologically open, and therefore the capacity to change because you are open and always incomplete. What makes us susceptible to being hurt, negative vulnerability, is the condition for growth and change. So without being vulnerable, creatures could not evolve, could not change. Being vulnerable is the capacity to be traversed and be open. So the opposite of vulnerability then is not power, because vulnerability is not powerlessness. Instead, the opposite of vulnerability is rigidity, is to be closed, to be stubborn, to live in fear. And rigidity is exactly what we seem to be doing, even in the so-called ecological transition. We have the rigidity of consumptive lives, the rigidity of the consumptive apparatus that is the mark of social economic systems today, the literal rigidity of what we call modern development, sidewalks, asphalt, highways, dams, bridges, fences, they're all literally rigid. None of them open. They either collapse or they stay. Rigidity doesn't have a middle way. There's the mental rigidity of not being able to imagine other futures. So being open and vulnerable in the positive sense is a way of being, in a way, eager to change. So then the question is, what kinds of ideas and actions can inhabit this space of vulnerable interrelations such that we can change in positive ways? If we follow what has been said so far, then change has always been the norm. What we are undergoing now is more rapid by any measure, but change has always been the norm. David Graeber, anarchist anthropologist that also sadly passed away 2 years ago, called anthropology the best political science. And the reason for that is that anthropology is an enormous repository of the way in which societies have changed. It is a repository of social and political experimentation through time. We've basically, from about 300,000 years ago, we've had infinitely multiple experiences in different living arrangements. None of these were perfect, but many are inspiring, and many are giving kind of courage and imagination that we need. So I think one way to try to find out what it means to be vulnerable in the positive sense of open to change is to briefly visit some ways of living and thinking that sound strange in a way to modern conceptions, but that in fact have a lot more precedent in different ways of living and thinking that we have forgotten. So I want to briefly visit Aotearoa, New Zealand. And one of the reasons for doing that is that the islands that are called Aotearoa by the Maori and New Zealand by the settlers have only been settled by people, actually by mammals at all, 800 to 1,000 years ago. When I first heard that, it really blew my mind. There was no mammals at all until 800 years ago. Then Polynesian navigators arrived in seafaring canoes. Amazing, amazing feat. The reason why there were no mammals there is because nobody could get there. It's so far away. And Polynesian navigators managed to. And in just a couple of hundred years, what were Polynesians became Maori in a land that was completely different from the home that they had left behind. In other words, Aotearoa, New Zealand is a very good view into what it means to rapidly change and rapidly experiment. What was a foreign land became a home. In other words, there was nothing rigid about those first Polynesian navigators. Now, I want to pick a couple ideas that we know from Maori thinkers today that have become part of the Maori universe through this time of making a home in New Zealand. For Maori philosophy and thinking, the universe is a giant kin. It's composed of family relations, of constitutive interrelations, things that make you who you are. So relations make and change you, just like family relations do. In other words, the universe is like a genealogical tree. And the word for genealogy that's usually translated is wakapapa. So the universe as wakapapa means that it is like a genealogy. Now, it's interesting, we usually think of genealogy in terms of bloodlines. But if you look at your own genealogical tree, the bloodline is actually quite limited. Your genealogy is populated through alliances, through people coming into the family, branching off, and so on and so forth. Most of what we consider our sort of strict human genealogy is not based on bloodlines. The universe being genealogical also gives the idea that alliances between different kinds of creatures are what make a genealogy. That also means that we never have a full picture of what can be kin. I don't know what future family members will be related to me. I don't know what my actions today mean for future kin. And even the most obsessed of genealogy hunters have to stop at some point. They don't know the full extent of their genealogical tree. We never know exactly what populates us. Within this genealogical universe of the world as kin, how is the wind of life. The word how is the principle that animates this universe of kin relationships. How is a principle of exchange. And in fact, it's given literal embodiment when Maori meet by greeting, when Maori greet by touching noses. So literally exchanging the breath of life, their how, and therefore becoming intermingled in a genealogical relationship. In the Maori oratorical arts, when you start speaking in a formal occasion, you start with a recitation of your genealogy, starting with the mountain, the river, the valley, and on to family relationships. But in different occasions, the recitation changes. So if I'm here to speak because I want to strengthen my relationship to you, Olave, I will refer to someone that is somehow related to someone else I know that relates both of us. And then that part of my genealogy is activated, and that brings us into closer relationship. In a different occasion, I want to connect to someone else. I do the same thing, so my genealogical story changes. Otherwise, again, we never know what makes us. And the openness to find out is fundamental. Now, how animates all of these encounters, the wind of life? And how is also translated very interestingly as reciprocity. The reciprocation of what? Well, that remains to be seen. But reciprocity in a universe that is built genealogically is a logic of exchange. Things come back and forth and back and forth. Now, perhaps this idea of exchange gives us a way to live with vulnerability in a positive sense, by asking what and to who can I give back? The what, of course, depends on to who. The more I know about what forms me, the more I know about the kinds of things that I can give back. What you give back to soil bacteria or to fungi that we now know are fundamental in keeping us healthy is not the same thing that you give back to a family member in recognition of the care that they gave you. The what depends on the who. But one way to take that and apply it to the idea of vulnerability is that we have a duty to perpetually expand who counts, what relationships count, what matters of concern, to use again an expression of Bruno Latour's, make us who we are. In other words, vulnerability is also a way to root ourselves in a positive kind of ignorance. I don't know what makes me, but I know that I can constantly find out. And in finding out, I can engage in reciprocal exchange. So how can everything that I've said so far, which may seem quite abstract, well, it is in some sense, how can it be lived? And how is it lived in the ecocene, in the age of ecology? Well, one way in which it is lived, I think, is through the idea of ecological restoration. Perhaps the idea of socio-ecological restoration, as I'll explain. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of restoration. Restoration, as an ecological idea, starts its life as a technical fix to industrial destruction. Okay? So the idea is I can damage an environment, and then, because of technique, I can make it back what it is. Or its equivalent, which I love that, right? So it's like if I cut down this forest, but I plant out another one that is its equivalent, however you judge that, then I've managed to restore the damage. So that's how restoration starts its life, not very promising. And yet, it quickly becomes unworkable as a template of what restoration can mean, because, of course, it is impossible to turn back the clock. It's impossible to go back to a baseline of what things used to be. So the baseline, what I'm trying to get back to, instead of a goal, becomes an indication of possibilities. What used to live there before damage, for instance, and therefore that tells me what could live there in the future. Instead of a strict criterion, it's an indication. Now, this mutation of restoration from a technical fix concerned with baselines to we can't really get there, what do we do with it, opens up other meanings that I think are more helpful here. Restoration can be seen as a kind of relearning of generative relations. How do we give back? What is to be restored then is not a particular environment, but the relationship to a particular environment. In other words, what it is to be restored is the art of paying attention, the art of paying attention in order to know who to give back, what, when, where, etc. Again, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there's a Maori group called the Tuhoi, who live in the North Island in the east, in a very expansive forest. And in the latest management plan for their land, who they gained sort of sovereignty over in 2014, they start the management plan by saying us Tuhoi need to relearn ways of living in the forest, of living in the land, by paying attention and by relearning the art of paying attention. This also flies in the face of our idea of indigeneity as something fixed in space and time, and instead shows us that the preoccupation with relearning and restoring our relationships is by now a universal one. So restoration can be seen as restoring sensible relations, relations that know how to respond. Donna Haraway uses this term, responsibility, by dividing it, saying response-ability, the ability to be moved, the ability to be affected, and to respond. The ability, to go back to Isabel Stengers, of knowing what obliges us to reciprocate. So let's give some examples of this kind of restoration. One of the oldest restoration projects in the world is at the University of Wisconsin in the US. It's over 85 years old. It was started by Aldo Leopold, who's one of the mythical fathers of environmentalism. He is the initiator of the land ethic. Sand County Almanac is the book that sort of made his name and made a big mark on environmental thinking. So Aldo Leopold in the 30s started what's called the University of Wisconsin Arboretum, and nowadays is known as the Curtis Prairie. So what they wanted to do is to restore a prairie environment. And there, again, you cannot really respect a strict baseline. The idea is, okay, this kind of grasses, this kind of animals lived here, and they're under threat because of changing conditions, because of human actions. Part of the changing conditions because of human actions had to do with losing the ability to pay attention to what's important to a prairie environment. So, since the 1930s, in a participatory and voluntary manner, they've done yearly prescribed burns. Okay? They set fire to parts of the prairie every year. And you can volunteer, local communities can participate, and so on and so forth. And because it's an yearly event, it's ritualized. You come back to it every year. You have a ritual exchange through fire with an environment that transforms you as you transform it. The ritual of going through the safety drills, putting on the right equipment, knowing how to pay attention to where to burn, for how long, how. Now, in this ritual exchange through fire, something that didn't matter before starts to matter. Fire matters. This, by the way, is how a lot of Native Americans in the Midwest managed prairies and managed open grasslands was through fire. In fact, part of the reason why the United States has so many prairies, or had so many prairies, is the Native American interaction with fire and the land. So, in the University of Wisconsin Arboretum, what we have is a ritualized restoration of a relationship where fire matters. To stay with the United States, but move to New York, the Bronx River Alliance has been for over a decade involved in a restoration project of the Bronx River. Who knew here that the Bronx had a river? Right, definitely not a majority. Well, apparently that came as a surprise to a lot of Bronx residents too, because the Bronx River was an open sewer with industrial effluent, basically symbolizing the marginalization of the neighborhood he was passing through. Also their invisibilization, just like the Bronx had become invisible, the Bronx River was invisible too. The Bronx River Alliance, as the name says, is an alliance between different grassroots organizations that describes itself as the river's voice. And over the last 10 or 15 years, it has tried to restore parts of the river. Now, of course, what it means to restore the Bronx cannot in any way accord with a baseline. Right? Where would you go back to? Before settlement, before the formation of Manhattan as we know it, etc., etc. So instead, the only thing that can be restored is a certain kind of relationship. They have different pillars. One is ecology. The next one, which I love, is the river as classroom. So they take a lot of school-age kids to the river as a classroom. The river as community and community building, and the creation of green corridors and gardens. So the way the Alliance works is it works both with the New York Parks Department and with local communities in order to engage in different ritualized restorations. For instance, the seeding of oysters, or the planting of vegetation on the banks to reduce erosion, or teaching kids how to canoe, something that in the Bronx, particularly in poorer communities, you don't get to do very often. They're also building green corridors and gardens where people can learn about food crops, plant them, harvest them. Now, these ritual exchanges teach people things that matter that they didn't know before. Oysters matter, seasons matter, canoes matter. They teach people how to give back, and in that giving back, reshape who and what they are. What the river gives back to them is pride, courage, a political voice, and a larger field of meaningfulness. The Bronx River, from a sewer of marginalization, becomes a relationship of empowerment, where I placed the oysters, I learned how to canoe, I learned what it is to harvest food. Now, in these two examples, I point ritual out quite explicitly. And the reason why I think it's important is because if you think about restoration as restoration of generative relationships, you cannot restore once. It doesn't make any sense. You cannot go do one thing and now my relationship to the place is restored, never go again. Reciprocity, if we follow the Maori understanding of reciprocity as an ontological category, is a way of life, and therefore has to be and can be learned and educated. And that's exactly what rituals do. Rituals teach us how to observe different things. They tell us that there's spirits, that there's winds, that there's dreams that matter. For instance, in Aboriginal Australia, dreams matter. That there's bugs that matter, that there's seasons that matter. Rituals of different kinds, ceremonies, point out things that make us, that we didn't know were part of our genealogy. They teach our sensibility towards the needs of others. And, most importantly, they teach the skills that we need in restoring these relationships. The ritual of setting fire to the prairie teaches one literally how to do it. The rituals of restoring the Bronx River teach kids and people participating lots of different skills of interactions that themselves then reveal other kinds of creatures that matter to them. So rituals, I think, are really, really important in achieving a kind of reciprocity that opens up our vulnerability in a positive way. Now, of course, ritualized restoration is just one example of how we can live vulnerably. And there's others too. There's lots of others. For instance, there's lots of legal experiments nowadays that are going in the same direction, the resurrection of the commons, for example, which has also been a very ritualized way of interacting with the land in a non-property driven way. The movement of rights of nature that I've written about quite extensively is also very interesting in the way in which it tries to bring reciprocity into the law. There's agricultural movements like agroecology, permaculture, food forests, and so on and so forth. The point is that alliances abound, they're possible, and these alliances have to be made around the idea of mutual beneficence, the idea of reciprocity. Whether it's ritualized restoration, whether it's degrowth, whether it's the commons, we need these to be alliances around the idea of regeneration. In other words, we can no longer afford ideological purity. Cannot say, well, I'm a degrowth advocate and therefore the restoration part is not my piece of cake. We need alliances. So to come back to where we started, loss. Loss has obviously settled in all the ways that we've talked about. And now it's only a question of extent. Not that we will undergo loss, but how much and of what exactly. But we can do something about that. And I hope that the path of thought that I've sketched tonight give us some ideas of what we can do about it. First of all, we can resist rigidity and learn vulnerability as a kind of superpower. Learn openness as a power. Learn to undergo this loss in a generative way. We can learn how to read environments and attend to their and therefore to our changing patterns and needs. We can perpetually restore the conditions of meaningful lives, not their form. And I think this is really important to underline. That in restoring in the way that I talked about, I'm not interested in restoring the form, exactly what I want. That is something that is impossible anyway. I'm interested rather in restoring conditions of meaningfulness. For instance, creating soils for whatever will grow there tomorrow. I do not have the ability of predicting how plant distributions will change, for instance, but I know that without healthy soils, there's no plants. So in recreating soils, I cannot do it for a particular form. I can do it as recreating generative conditions. We can create rituals that build the skills of paying attention that we will need no matter what the world will look like tomorrow. In other words, we can create future ecologies where joy is still possible. In the shadows of, and perhaps as resistance to the tragedy that has already happened. And I'll leave you with that. Should I join you?
Come on over. Please, sit down.
Was it mine?
No, that's over there. Because I didn't know which one you preferred. Have a moment.
Yes.
Collect yourself. Find some energy again. And I'll just briefly speak to the audience.
Talk for 5 minutes.
A few minutes, like 2 or 3. I will do 2 or 3 minutes. Hang in there. We are about to do 2 things now. We're about to have a quick conversation, you and I, about what you have just shared with us, and also mostly what you have written. Dr. Tănăsescu, can I just say Mihnea?
Yes, please, yeah. Please, it's so much better.
Has published a book this year called Ecocene Politics that I read it and then thought, this has to be the opening lecture of Future Ecologies. So I am deeply inspired by this book, so I will be even reading some quotes from this book, and I encourage you all to get a copy. I'm going to make sure that there's a link to where you can buy it on our social media, to where you can buy this book, because even though you're a great speaker, you're an even better writer. No, you're great at everything. But this is a really, really, really beautiful book. I think y'all should have it. We'll make sure there's a link online. So we'll be discussing the book, we'll be discussing the lecture. But normally we do in the last 15 minutes, we give you all the opportunity to ask questions, Q&A. I don't really like Q&As. I'm not a big fan of Q&As, especially when I'm in the audience. I get very nervous. I may have heard something that I want to respond to, that I want to say something about, but then I'm like, oh, I have to ask it as a question, but maybe I don't have a question. Maybe I just want to say something, And then you're like, the whole time that we're talking, I'm basically trying to figure out how I'm gonna, and then I end up giving up because I'm like, okay, I can't figure out how to make this a question, so then I end up giving up. So I basically suggest we just forget this question format, right? So if there's anything that resonated with you, if you have anything you want to comment upon, if you have anything you want to add to, it doesn't have to be a question. You can just say it, right? Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to respond or you have to respond. You're welcome to, obviously. But it could also just be we just pile up on ideas and concepts and insights and perspectives. Is that okay? No, and if you have a question, ask a question. But if you don't, just share with us, okay?
Also like situations and feelings and, how...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't believe you just said that, and that hurts my feelings. You could do that. So
Absolutely.
it's better if you tell us which feelings were hurt and why, but, it doesn't have to be a question. I think that the whole question format can be kind of, can make things more difficult than they need to be. Also, we have obviously people who are on the live stream. I have right here, this is why I'm holding this computer the whole time, is so that if you have any questions or comments that I can relay them for you. So, type away. Okay. How are you feeling?
Good.
Was this enough time for you to get back?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm here.
Okay.
So now after saying that questions are sterile, you're going to ask me a bunch of questions.
I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions.
Okay, we can do that. Okay.
Because I got to prepare for a long time, so I've got questions. Okay, maybe it's not questions. Maybe I'll just read some of the things you've written, and maybe you want to reflect and comment further on it.
Say how I will rewrite them.
Huh?
Say how I would rewrite them.
Yeah, you should rewrite it, exactly.
Go ahead.
No.
Yeah, please. That sounds good.
That's a better way, right? Okay. First of all, this is other than what I prepared. I did not expect that you would end on such a hopeful note. I did not expect that. And I'll tell you why I did not expect this person
I'm sorry, it was hopeful.
to end on such, because it was a rather positive note, right? It's a hopeful, okay, well, let me read something. If I can find it. I did not prepare, but this is really...
Because you didn't think I was going to be that hopeful.
Okay, wait, I think I found it. The progressive political answer to loss is often some variation on the theme of hope. When faced with grave problems, it is assumed that being hopeful, finding scenarios that fuel the feeling of hope, is what can drive people forward. This book starts from a different assumption, that hope is not necessarily the principle of action it is deemed to be. Hope is necessary for action only if one believes in a magical ability to control the world according to one's wishes. So what happened between you writing this in your preface and today? What has given you...
I talked about chance and change as fundamental concepts. Yeah, that's what happened. Now, I still stand by that. If you found that hopeful, it wasn't out of design, let's put it that way. Okay. It's just that you can read it as hopeful in the sense of, well, there's things I can do, right? But what I mean is that the things you can do will not end the way that you anticipate, okay? So I can participate in reciprocal exchange. I can learn about what makes a healthy soil, right? And in my interactions, if I have a garden or if I'm farmer or whatever, try to reciprocate, right, the parts of the soil that I know are important, that are becoming important to me as I learn more about it. But it's hubris to think that whatever I prefer for that particular soil now will continue to be the case in the future. Okay, so for instance, a lot of a popular way of they say that you planting the tree, right, is a way of leaving something to the next generation, right? Yeah. But if you think about it that way, then I also oblige the next generation to eat the fruit that I like, right? Yeah. Yeah. Instead, what you can sort of bequeath on the next generation is the condition for them to plant whatever the hell they want. You see? Okay. Yeah. And there's not necessarily hope in the sense of I hope that, and then there's a list of wishes, right, that basically have to do with a supposed ability to control what will come. Instead, it's a way of interacting today that engages me in the world in an expansive manner, where I am transformed by finding out about what makes me constantly, right? And it's really about now, it's about today. Yeah. It's not necessarily about future states of affairs. Yeah. So I think that's why I start by saying this is not that, or rather, you don't need hope as such to think in this way. Okay.
And especially not magical thinking. I think that's where...
Definitely not.
Definitely. Okay. When you were talking, I realized something that I also did not prepare for, but I kind of want to raise with you. I realized that in your synthesis of what ecology teaches us, going back to the situational, to the relational, to the local, I realize that there seems to be a kind of not necessarily what you're saying, but you seem to contradict a particular type of environmental activism that is very much emerging in the last few years of environmental justice. This notion of, it's not whether or not you personally recycle or not, whether you personally, eat vegan, but that it's the global, the bigger picture, the policy, the big polluter, like this notion of it's capitalism, stupid. Like it's like this notion is bigger than what my personal and everyday choices are, and I just realized that I feel like what you're saying, saying maybe it's not the global, maybe it is back to what my relations are, my local situation is what it is about. Do you see that as a contradiction, or am I not?
No,
do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I see why you could take it that way, but that's not how I think about it at all, actually. And I want to come back to this idea of alliances, right? I don't think that those are necessarily contradictory. I think you can hold those thoughts together, as it were, right? I mean, we know empirically that recycling doesn't really help. And that what we recycle, as Bio was saying the other day at Ecopolis, is mostly sent to other countries for them to deal with it, right? So in that sense, I mean, this is not a paean to choice. It's simply trying to look at, again, the scale where things matter in your everyday life, right? But you can still discern within that what is sort of beyond your ability to control, like the production of plastic. And I mean this in a real sense of solidarity with the capitalocene, with the plantationocene, with environmental justice and climate justice. And I think you can work at these scales simultaneously. You just can't do it all at once. And that's where I think that, sort of leaving behind ideological purity, unless you focus on capital as the thing, then you are not an ally. It's like, well, no, you can hold those things together, and I don't think they have to trip over each other. You know?
Well, I think that would be contentious in many places, but okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Now back to what I prepared. Okay. Also, by the way, I should say, I have a tendency to ask a million questions, and I don't see you very well, which means I can't tell if you want to say something or if you want to ask a question because of the lighting situation here. I can barely see. Oh, yeah, this is
there
better.
you are.
Oh, Ellen, this man. By the way, I forgot to say, the people here at MIRI are really amazing to us also. So thank you, Ellen. Okay, thank you so much. So yeah, this is better. So if you want to say something, raise your hand, and Helena will come to you. Okay? Don't be shy. Again, I won't see you, so do this towards Helena. Okay. So back to what I prepared. I wanted to read something. Page 110. Do you remember what you said on page 110?
No, just on 109.
Let me help you with that.
Far.
You spoke. You spoke quite a bit on the Maori philosophies and how what they inspire, what they mean, and what you think we could take from that. But you also write, this is not a question of juxtaposing indigenous and Western philosophies in a binary and often caricatured way that is inimical to the recomposition and renovation of diverse practices. Instead, I'm interested in following the thread of a concept as it appears through multiple instantations. And these are to be found wherever they have manifested, whether through Western philosophies or indigenous ones. Why did you feel the need to say this? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, because I feel like there's a lot of caricaturing of, indigenous thinking, and I love it. Even like well-meaning people often refer to what I call indigenous philosophical traditions, indigenous intellectual traditions, indigenous thought as cosmovisions, beliefs, spiritual thinking, right? There's always that sort of qualifier, right? That puts it in a different category than what we do, which is philosophy proper, or intellectual tradition. And I think that's bullshit. I don't think that that's how it works. I think that every culture has an intellectual tradition which is formed from a series of ideas and concepts that are important in how that society lives and structuring it, right? So that's one of the things that I had in mind. The other thing is that, again, I feel like there's a lot of resources in, and I come back to anthropology here, it's a huge library of experimentation, and you can look through those experiments, including the ones that you're most familiar with, like your own cultures, right, and your own political systems, in order to stimulate the imagination, to think again. And when you do that, you also see a lot of different overlaps, right? So there's in a lot of Maori thinking, the body appears as intelligent, okay? And there's not something that consciously, right, we would say in the Western world, the body is seen as intelligent. No, we have the body-mind separation and so on and so forth. But if you pay attention to that idea in Maori philosophy, and then look at how we use language, then you see that that idea is not foreign to a lot of Western traditions. So we say the eye sees, right? The hand touches, and it's not strange to say that. If anything, it'd be strange to say otherwise. So there's, in our languages and on everyday practices, you see this sort of most ontological commonalities, right? That give you a grounding, that give you a way to speak beyond the silo of your supposed cultural way of thinking, And I think that's really interesting when you basically treat, in this sense, engage with Maori philosophy on a completely equal footing with, Western philosophy. I think that opens up really interesting possibilities.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Besides it being a matter of justice, because you were speaking about,
I absolutely agree. Yeah, I shared this concern with the ways in which the ways in which we are sort of, there's a particular traditions now coming up of people trying to valorize and, indigenous or native or, pre-colonial philosophies in ways that I often feel like are infantilizing, and in a way that feels like it's, like it's made static, it's made with good intentions at times, where I worry about this openness of these ways of thinking and of living, and I think that if we do think of it as unequal fitting, if we can practice and think through and see the similarities and indeed accept that equalness, then there is also these philosophies and these worldviews are allowed to grow and change. And
yeah, that's the thing. Like they change all the time. That's exactly the point. This idea of fixed in place is actually a colonial idea that comes from the assimilation of the indigenous to nature, and the assimilation of Europeans to civilization, right, which is seen as opposed to nature. So indigenous philosophies are A, close to nature, and B, sort of forever the same. That is an idea of relatively recent origin, and it has to do with a particular very violent interaction between Europeans and native populations. However, the interesting part is that if you look sort of on the margins of that tragedy, there's many different encounters that provoke hybrids, right? And the early history, for instance, of European settlement in Aotearoa, New Zealand, so between 1769, when James Cook landed for the first European to land on the New Zealand shore, and the beginning of the 19th century, Maori had a demographic superiority, and Europeans could only be there as guests, right? And Maori were very adept at sort of using Europeans for their own political purposes, right? And in that time, there's a huge exchange of ideas between these different people. And Maori chiefs traveled to Europe, and they knew very well, what European cities were like, what European thought was like, et cetera, et cetera. There was Europeans that learned the Maori language and became, genealogically related to Maori hosts and so on and so forth. So there's this moment where exchange is possible, And again, in a recent book by David Graeber and David Wengrow, it's called The Dawn of Everything, they show how Native American philosophies were really influential in the European Enlightenment.
Oh, really?
And they even go as far as arguing that the Enlightenment idea of freedom, for instance, of liberty, comes from Native American philosophers.
Really?
Right?
What's the
And
name of
it
this book
comes
again?
The Dawn of Everything.
The Dawn of Everything. Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of like the what is life, the dawn of everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot. If you start to think from this position of radical equality, then you see these exchanges have gone on in the past as well, and there's no reason to sort of infantilize or to fix in place, and instead of allowing for a new kind of co-evolution and exchange.
Yeah. I think there's someone you just walked up to. Okay. Talk to us.
Yes.
By the way, you can also say things in Dutch. I can translate, and you understand Dutch.
I do, yeah.
Yeah. So in case that's an issue, go on.
Well, in my head, I prepared it in English.
No, it's
so
fine.
I actually have two questions. Maybe they don't really make sense, but I was wondering, when hearing that you had lived in quite a few places, and your personal your research into everything you just told about, how all of that has affected your personal relation to the place where you're at, or like your immediate environment, the physicality of it. It sparked my curiosity. I can also tell you my second question, but maybe you want to...
No, go ahead.
Yeah?
The second question. Yeah.
Relating to that, I was also wondering about what maybe alliances or have meant a lot to you in developing this research and this curiosity, maybe. Not only in which researchers you quote or whatever, but also, I don't know, maybe like Donna Haraway, her companion species, that sort of idea.
I am so glad you asked these two
that's an
questions.
awesome question. You should have thought of that.
I should have thought of it. Because I always try to get this, because we've had a few interviews and like panel events before where I moderate, and every time I try to get him to talk about his olive trees or the olive trees and the Romanian Delta, because thank you. This was a perfect question. Talk to us.
And they're also, I mean, I take it as question part A and part B, you know, because they really are related, and those are wonderful questions. Thank you so much. You know what? I mean, I left. I was born in Romania, in Bucharest, and I left home when I was quite young. I was 16, and then, as you said, I lived in multiple places. I've done research in different places. Now I live in Brussels. I've been there for over 12 years at this point. It's the longest I've ever been anywhere, except my first 16 years. And for a while, when I was in the middle of all these changes, I was tempted by this idea of a citizen of the world. You know, we often hear this thing. And just like I said in the talk, I think it's impossible to relate to the planet, right? Or to say, I am a citizen of the whole, right? I've come to see that, to me, that was meaningless, because it didn't give me a way to be on Earth, right? So you would sort of invoke an Earth or world that you actually couldn't connect with, because the mentality of sort of a citizenship of the world is of rootlessness. On the other hand, my own experience shows me that to be rooted doesn't mean to belong to a place, right? And often the rootedness part, particularly in political terms, turns into the sort of blood and soil type of nativism, which I think is obviously politically very, very dangerous, but also, to me, not necessary for understanding relationships to place. So the way in which I've come to live my life is to have, again, to try to understand what are the things that oblige me to pay attention in the places where I'm lucky enough to live or to work. And how can I become part of that local genealogy? How can I participate in that sense, right? So in Brussels, to give you a silly example, I try to learn a lot about urbanism, right? And to understand, to be able to read the landscape, because there's so much history etched in the landscape, and I just sort of ignorantly walk around. And as I learn more about that and can share it with my daughter, can share it with friends, can share it with guests, I become a Bruxellois, right? Being a Bruxellois is not being born in Brussels, as far as I'm concerned, is being involved in that genealogical relationship to that place. So in that sense, I feel like a really rich person because I have a bunch of homes. Another one is in southern Italy, where together with my partner, I have a little olive grove that I spend a lot of time in. You described it the other day, of you watch olives grow. Yeah, which is like, well, I'll be a very old man by the time I actually see it grown. And there too, I have the same approach. I think that I can be close to olive trees in Italy as well as architecture in Brussels. I've also worked a lot in the Danube Delta in Romania, and have spent years sort of going there quite often. For 4 years, I went every other month, for at least a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, depends. And made friends, have gotten to know it very well. I wouldn't say that I'm of the Delta or from the Delta because my commitment to the place has not been long-term, right? But I can say that when I write about it, I know people that are of the Delta that can check what I'm saying, right? And that I can converse with. I know I have an embodied experience of what it is to smell the Delta, to hear it, right? One experience that really I will never forget in the Danube Delta is that for the first time, I was at the end of the village, and Sfântu Gheorghe village is on the coast of the Black Sea. And I was in a corner of the village. There's no traffic in that village because it's in the middle of a wetland. It's 2 hours by boat from the closest city. And it was dusk, and there was a lot of animal sounds, a lot of sounds of weather, wind, water, animals, and people. And for the first time, I heard people as creatures in that landscape, right? Because human noise was not the dominant sort of noise, and therefore it wasn't the background on which other sounds appeared. It was the opposite. The background was the weather and other creatures, and then you would hear speech, right? And that experience is something that ties you to that place. Again, I think it'd be arrogant to say, now I know the Delta, or no, absolutely not. But there's ways in which you can grow little shoots here and there, and sort of allow those to transform you. All of this to connect to part B, and many other experiences I've been lucky to have, are situations that make me think. And here I want to again refer to Isabelle Stengers and her work, and also Vinciane Després and her work as well, where the question is, how do you become sensible to situations such that they make you think anew? And in fact, where a bunch of what I talked about comes from doesn't look like what I've talked about at all. So it's things like the reintroduction of European bison in the southern Carpathians in Romania. And I went there to look at rewilding as a social and political practice, right? And that situation and the way in which the bison were sort of acting in that situation made me think of restoration, of relationships and not of environments. But that is not something that was planned out. There's not something that came from theory. It's something that living in that situation made me think. And then it's like, oh, okay, that's interesting, let's go forward. So yeah, does that answer? I think that's what your questions make me think. Yeah.
Anyone else? No, not yet? Okay. Percolate those thoughts. I wanna connect to what you just said about sort of these different places that you've been at, and sort of like how you were able to place or be part, or like shoots get rooted. And one of the things you say in, wait, let me find out which page exactly.
I think it's 175.
No, 167.
I was close.
You write, nature. Oh, this is so difficult. Why did I decide to do it in this format? Okay, but we're keeping it on with it. Okay, this is what we chose. You talk about responsibility, and I feel like you seem to have a problem with responsibility. Wait, hold on. There is no need to pin the fate, nature to the responsibility of humanity. Simply and hyperbolically put, humans cannot be responsible for nature as such. Okay, you spend almost a chapter talking about responsibility and I think you have a problem with it. So could you perhaps What is your problem with responsibility as a logic of pursuing, I guess, environmental justice?
I'm just irresponsible. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I don't have a problem with responsibility. I have a problem with the idea that the way in which to think environmental justice, for instance, or our relationship to the world in a time of ecological crisis is that humans have become responsible for nature. And the reason why I have a problem with that idea, again, is not because of responsibility as such, is because to be responsible, response-able, you also have to be able. Like you have to have the capacity for what you're responsible for, right? So I cannot be responsible for flying a plane if I don't have the capacity to do it, if I don't know how to do it, okay? And we're very bad at managing the natural world, okay? We're very bad at it. Particularly whenever we want to direct the way ecological processes are going, we usually mess it up. And that's because it's not really in our capacity to be responsible in that way. What is in our capacity is to be responsible for each other.
Okay.
That we understand much better, right? And that's where in the book I tie responsibility to reciprocity. And what I do there is turn both upside down, right? I say, well, reciprocity, which is usually thought of as an exchange between humans, right? And gift exchange is sort of the paradigmatic example. It holds between humans and worlds. What I can do with the world is reciprocate it. What I can do with humans is be responsible for their well-being. But the catch is that the only way to actually be responsible for your well-being is to reciprocate our common environment.
Yeah.
Because there's no way in which human well-being can exist outside of environmental well-being. So you see, those two are together. And I think to me it matters that the accent is not first and foremost as I'm responsible for the environment, but rather what is in my ability is to be responsible for fellow creatures, and the way that I must do that is through enhancing the natural world.
But then, how many of you live in a city? Yeah. I see at least one person who does not live in a city. That's rare. Most of us live in cities now.
Sure.
And I think when you say reciprocate with the environment and to enhance the natural environment, for most of us who live in cities, that sounds like something we're not able to do.
Of course we are.
We are?
Sure.
How? I mean, I don't want you to necessarily tell us what to do tomorrow or something, but I'm just trying to think of ways in which this notion of reciprocating and to sort of enhance, to become responsible for each other through the enhancement of this natural environment. And I follow you, but I also feel like so much of the power relations or the knowledge that we hold feel as if we may not be able, so we therefore cannot be responsible. Does that make sense? Am I...
Well, I mean, it does make sense. I just think we mean different things by being able. I think I mean it in a quite ontological way, and I think you mean it there in a political way. Not able in the sense that there's power structures in place that make it very, very difficult, right? But all things being equal...
And differentiated access to knowledge as well.
Absolutely, and to financial resources, to power in a very real sense. But it's funny that you bring up the city, because I don't. Again, we tend to think of the city and nature.
Yeah, but you're right. We should not focus on the uniqueness of what is left over somewhere far away, but we should focus on focus on restoring environments everywhere. Such that every human being is part and parcel of a greater natural community. Well, most of us, again, live in cities.
Sure, but the Bronx River lives in a city too.
Okay.
You see, there's a lot, actually, and there's a whole movement of urban restoration now, which is mostly focused around water, 'cause people have always had a very special relationship with bodies of water. Also, the rights of nature that I wrote about quite a bit, a lot of that comes out of relationships with water, with rivers, and things like that. So urban restoration nowadays is very much connected with restoring rivers in cities. Now, if you go look at that literature and those case studies, a lot of it is done in a technical way. So it's saying, let's say in Brussels, the Zene, right? Now it's an underground sewer, let's restore it. So then there's, and the usual...
Is there a project to
No.
restore? Okay.
I
was like, whoa,
hypothetical.
that.
Hypothetical. Well, they're struggling to do something with a canal forever, but anyway, that's a different discussion. But say hypothetically, right? Let's restore river B in city A. Okay. The usual way of doing it would be, okay, we bring in the heavy equipment, dig it out, redo the banks, etc., etc. Now we can have valuable riverside property in city B. What I'm saying is that if you don't think about restoration in those terms, but you think about it as restoring relationships, there's no reason why most of those actions could not be done with the participation of local people. Right? It's not the restoration part is not technically difficult necessarily. You see? It's simply a matter of thinking about it in a way that allows you to include it in meaning making. And there's nothing that sort of expels the city from that at all. And you can do it in big ways or in small ways. Yeah. I don't know, does that soothe your worry a bit or just deepen it?
No, I think we have, before I respond.
Hi. Thank you, first of all, Dr. Tănăsescu, for your lecture. It was very interesting. I myself am conducting a PhD on rights of nature. Nice. So I want to pick in here on your what you said about responsibility, reciprocity, and rights of nature. So I kind of want to bridge your two most recent works because I read your Understanding Rights of Nature with a lot of interest, and I found it a very critical analysis that it resonated with me and inspired me. So I just want to mention that, or ask and mention, as this is open for statements as well, that in our world today, rights of nature seems to be more or closer to reality than the ecocene politics that you write about now. But rights of nature, do you think that in some form it is compatible with the ecocene politics based on locality and, for example, imbalance, and those concepts don't really seem to match with the dominant assumptions of rights of nature today? So I don't know, because I'm kind of confused by what you said today. Like, do you see a room for rights of nature in ecocene politics?
It's a very good question.
Very good question.
Well, see, I struggle with that because, as you said, I wrote a very critical book about the rights of nature. But again, in a spirit of solidarity, in saying, well, the dominant view of rights of nature is one that's formed on harmony, balance, rights, etc., etc. But it doesn't have to be so, and it's simply the dominant view, but there's lots of alternative histories. And in that book, I talk also about the Te Urawera and the Wanganui River case in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that's, again, a situation that made me think in two different ways, right? And one ended up in the Rights of Nature book, and the other one ended up here. And it's actually there that the rights of nature and ecocene politics meet with the idea of locality. Because in the Wanganui River case, or in Te Urewera, which is the ancestral home of Tuhoi, the Maori group I mentioned, it's not nature that gets rights. It's a particular environment that is related to particular people and their practices and their historical sovereignty that doesn't even get rights, it gets legal personality, right? And that's a very different thing from giving whatever right to nature as such. So I think that there's ways in which the law can innovate while being sort of rooted in chance, change, and locality, right? So in that sense, being ecological in my sense. And again, New Zealand is what revealed that possibility for me. In fact, I had done my PhD on the rights of nature in Ecuador, and after that, I started doing other things on rewilding and political representation, and then when New Zealand happened, that's why I was like, wow, wait, that's different, right? And it tells a different story, and it gives different possibilities that I think can be more fruitfully combined with the idea of the ecocene.
But what do you think then of, for example, Mar Menor now in Spain? Do you think that it aligns more with the Ecuadorian case or with the New Zealand approach?
I don't know. I have to look at it closely.
Okay.
I actually don't know.
Thank you.
I actually very much can empathize with your feelings of confusion with this book, because I feel like there's something that you do that is really interesting. You give a critical sort of reflection and tools of analysis of all kinds of initiatives along the lines of, is there space, does it account for change? Does it create space for change? Does it account for locality, and does it, I don't know, respect chance of it all? I find myself looking, whether it is like the next food bank, sort of time bank project next door or something. I find myself looking for these repetitive and ritualized sort of things you show, like you talk about. I'm sort of finding myself looking for, like, is there room for active involvement of more than human? Like, you do this really brilliantly, but at the same time, you also say you adhere to a particular, anarchist, non-dogmatic approach. So you're also saying, also don't look at all these things looking for dogmatic sort of conclusions that say, well, Tănăsescu said it should have this and this doesn't have that, so...
Yeah, don't do that.
No, so I find myself in this position. And I think maybe the last thing before... Does anybody have a question? Or did you want to... Oh, there's someone in the back. While you travel to the person in the back, I just want to perhaps ask you to perhaps say something, if possible, quickly before we get to the last question about that active involvement of not only local communities, but human and non-human entities. And just sort of perhaps reflect on them, and we have some examples of where that does go well. And then we have the last question far in the back. Do you want to pose the question first so that
let's just take
we can
it. Maybe
do them all
maybe
at once?
Similar.
Okay, thank you. My name is Bert. I'm teaching as well on the CASC. I'm doing now a minor which is called the Embassy of the Modern Human, but in which we try to find out how, as artists and designers, can engage within kind of the topics that you have discussed. But what we're struggling and also struggling with to kind of, in the discussion that we have with our colleagues, is kind of connected to the notion of time that we have, or because we often get the feeling that there is a kind of urgency in the cultural change that we have to go through, that the notions that you talk about, that we have to relearn. You can say that we maybe lost these kind of that knowledge slowly since the Enlightenment, that we slowly over a couple of centuries lost kind of to pay attention to relationships, to pay attention to how we name certain things. And my question or my thought is how do you think about the time that we have to kind of change the culture that we slowly built up to relearn all these things that you talked about, and what is the importance of artists, what is the importance of designers in kind of that process that we have to go through.
Mm.
Do this one first, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. That's really good. Well, I mean, obviously I'm not a designer, so I can't say exactly how design can help. But I think in general terms, well, I'll start somewhere else. So the way I think about modernity, because you can mean lots of things with modernity, right? And in the book, I'm quite specific about what I mean with modernity, and it's a whole bifurcation of nature thing, right? But I'll let you read about it if you're interested.
Read the book.
One way in which, by the way, it's also open access. So if whoever doesn't want to buy the paper copy can just download a PDF from the publisher.
Yeah.
The one way to think about modernity is the progressive forgetfulness, right, of what makes us. It's a loss of this ability to pay attention and to observe that you talk about. So I think that's why I'm really interested in ritualized practices which are able to repopulate, right, our environing world and show things that matter that I didn't know about before. And in this, the sciences are extremely important because we discover all the time things that make us that we didn't know about. But in sort of the general culture, this ability to pay attention and to observe your environment is still very much sort of educated out of people, right? And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about how you think designers can draw people's attention to things that they didn't know mattered to them. Whether it's in built spaces, in outdoor spaces. I don't have sort of examples in mind, but I'm sure it can. And in fact, I know that one of the first uses of the word ecocene was in a design book. Just Google design and ecocene and you'll get that, which was, a completely different sort of development of the idea. But, it says something that the term itself was also used in relationship with design. So I'd be curious, actually, I would turn the question back to you. What would it be like to ritualize design? How could you get people to notice the importance of shape, for instance? Just like in another aspect of life, you could get people to notice or to learn the immediate species with which they interact in their everyday urban life. I went chestnut gathering in Brussels the other day and discovered a bunch of new strands of chestnuts.
You discovered new, so you're a biologist as well?
No, I didn't discover. I like chestnuts.
You discovered
trees that I didn't know were there.
That are new to you.
Yes.
Not to
no,
science.
Of course not. No.
I was like, wow, this is impressive.
But you see what I mean? Like you I don't know. That's a stupid little example, but it has to do with cultivating, paying attention, and liking chestnuts enough.
Yeah, I was literally thinking about exactly this when my housemate came home and said, hey, because we have a dog and we walk our dog, and she had noticed that there were chestnuts falling on the ground. She said, it's such a shame. It's right there. We should pick it or else in a few months it will just be, it will rot and whatnot, even though I don't think that's really how the cycle of nature works. But still, I thought that was such an interesting observation that people who live in the Forêt Park area, that, the park has just given us chestnuts and it's right there. Yeah. And I thought that was really interesting. It made me think of some of that paying attention and being sensible and sensitive and sensible. Is the difference? Okay.
But actually, I don't know. We can talk about it afterwards. I'm really curious.
Bert, do you feel like you're up to the question to answer it? To try to answer it?
I don't know. No. Well, what really inspired me in your talk is the story about the Bronx, because in that story I sense the importance of the designer I don't know how the story goes or how it's actually executed. But kind of by changing, by restoring a river, I assume that a lot of professionals were involved or will be involved in the future. I don't know how far it is or the story, how real the story is already. But as designers or people changing kind of our environment, you talked about enabling people to relearn these things. So about enabling the possibility to go canoeing and learning what it means to be on the water and stuff like that. So that's something that I think as a designer is really important, kind of to enable these relationships and reveal these relationships that are there and the possibilities of these relationships. But still, I keep thinking about kind of the time it takes to kind of relearn these things. And for me, I have the feeling that I don't know a lot about these things. And by getting interested in this topic, it feels like like you said, it's how you are positioned in life. It's something that does not have an end story. It's how you live your life that's important. And I keep thinking about the urgency of the matter. And then you also talked about kind of the eco-realists or eco-modernists, which propose more modernism as an answer. And there's always a kind of discussion between, that's a quick fix. You just keep modernizing and use less energy and all these kind of things. And I always have the difficulty in finding a kind of slow cultural change that probably takes a couple of generations, and kind of seemingly easy fix of we just have to keep modernizing and then we'll get things better. We can reshape things.
Yeah, no, I totally share those worries. I mean, that there's a reason why, you know, I find the great acceleration to be a great concept, right? As the engine of the Anthropocene, right, and of what we're living, as the great acceleration. And I think it also a lived sense of time sort of accelerating, and the idea of urgency, crisis, right, doesn't really allow for much time for reflection. But it's also a huge problem, because usually when you react, right, that's when you make more mistakes. And again, here I take a lot of inspiration from Isabel Stengers, who has this idea of there's actually a book of hers that's called Slow Science, and she talks about slowing down thinking, right? And how when you slow down thinking, you can ask new kinds of questions, you can allow different kinds of things to make you think, different kinds of problems to appear. And, you know, when was talking to some plant pathologists about a year ago about this epidemic that is killing olive trees in southern Italy, right? And I was making this kind of argument, and the guy's like, yes, but, you know, the bacterium is killing trees. I need to do something, right? And I sympathize with that, obviously. In daily life, I mean, yes, if you have a crisis, you have to act. On the other hand, if you're always in crisis mode, I think there's something fundamentally wrong, right? I mean, crisis by its very sort of meaning is something that is episodic. If now we start defining everything by crisis, then we're literally constricting the space we have for thinking. And that's a huge problem. I think that's a bigger problem than the time it takes to actually relearn a bunch of things. I don't know if that helps at all, but it kind of helps me a bit.
I think that is a really great and I think very open-ended way to end this talk, because you kind of touch upon temporality and sort of the different scales at which these things are happening and the ecocene, and you position that. But I feel like there's, in what you just said right now, there's great, like it's an opening to a much more perhaps more political. We talked a little bit about the difference between philosophical and political just now, but like I think you're opening up here a way towards a political discussion, indeed, of urgency, and indeed this attunement, these sensibilities that we need to develop urgently, perhaps very slowly. I wanna thank you so much for your patience and your passion and your insights tonight. And I want to thank you for getting us started very powerfully this year with this Ecocene Politics. I hope you will come back as a visitor and to ask important questions and perhaps make very astute observations in the audience in the coming year. And I want to ask you all to help me thank Dr. Tănăsescu with a very warm applause once again.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks.
Loved, Bert, I'm sorry. I would have loved to see you to continue a little bit longer, but we always try to finish on time so that the technical people who are staying here late at night can also have their own lives and go about it. Thank you so much all for being here. Are there any of my students here of the course here tonight? Yeah? If you have any questions, I'm getting a lot of questions in my inbox. If you have any questions you want to ask me here now, this is a great opportunity to come up and ask me. Otherwise, we'll just let you go.
Okay.
And have a lovely evening.
Thank you. It's a lot of fun.